2. This is episode 177 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing, president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This week, I am pleased to be joined by Josh Blackman. He is Associate Professor of Law at South Texas College of Law in Houston. He specializes in constitutional law, the U.S. Supreme Court, the intersection of law and technology. Josh is the author of 3 books: Unprecedented, the Constitutional Challenge to Obamacare; Unraveled, Obamacare, Religious Liberty and Executive Power; and an Introduction to Constitutional Law, 100 Supreme Court Cases Everyone Should Know. Welcome to Tipping Point, New Mexico, Josh.
Thank you so much for having me. My first time in New Mexico. Happy to be here.
Yeah, and by the time this podcast is public, the Rio Grande Foundation and New Mexico chapter of the Federalist Society will have co-hosted an event at the UNM Law School with Josh Blackman on 100 Supreme Court cases in 60 minutes. And that is quite the epic ride. So why don't you talk about that book really quick? Because just from a purely publishing standpoint, it's rather innovative in the way you approach a very old technology of dead paper books.
Well, my colleague at Georgetown, Randy Barnett, and I, we publish a constitutional law case book. And this is this, 1,500-page doorstop that only law students would ever afford. And we realized that this entire volume of law can really be distilled down to 100 cases. And these are the cases that I think everyone should know. Anyone who wants to be conversant in the Constitution should know. And what we did, we wrote very short discussions of each case, 2 to 3 pages each. And the idea is you can read through this book all the way through, or maybe one chapter at a time, or even jump around, to give yourself an overview of where the Supreme Court has ruled over the past 2 centuries. We also innovated. We developed a video library. We took audio from the Supreme Court and we mixed it with our own discussion of the case. We took photographs, videos of the parties, maps, and other pieces of media, and we created this entire library, 11 hours in length, that allows you to binge watch constitutional law. It's a really innovative process, and we're so excited. It's been taking off in ways we did not even anticipate.
Yeah, now you're part of the Federalist Society, and they have a mindset, if you will, when it comes to the law, that they're conservatives and libertarians interested in the current state of the legal order. Want to share a little bit about who you are and your philosophy. Do you have maybe a more libertarian outlook, a more conservative outlook? When you someday are being grilled in front of Congress for your court
God,
seat,
Lord help you.
What would you respond to your judicial philosophy question?
I appreciate it. I've given some thought to this, but thankfully I'm not a judge, so I don't give it a lot of thought. But I start from very basic principles. Text matters. The original meaning of the Constitution really matters. And when judges construe provisions of the Constitution, they should always start with text and history. There's always questions of what role stare decisis precedent plays. When you're a lower court judge, you have a little bit you have a very short leash because there's not much you can do given precedent. When you're Supreme Court justice, precedent doesn't work the same way. Politically, I tend to be quite libertarian. I'm not very socially conservative. Although increasingly, I've the last couple of years, I've found myself defending policies that I don't very much agree with. On immigration, I'm pretty lax on immigration enforcement. I don't think it's a good use of resources, and I think we could stand to benefit from lots of people who want to come here. But unfortunately, our laws are quite draconian, and so long as the laws are on the books, they should be enforced. And I'm hesitant when either courts or executives try to deviate from the laws as they are written.
Well, let's talk about that because I think most libertarians do have a pretty open view of immigration policy, but they also prefer a system. And of course, Congress is in charge of creating those systems. Presidents execute systems theoretically put in place by Congress. And one of, I'm no lawyer. I studied business in school. I run a free market think tank. We don't do immigration. But one of the things I understand about our immigration policy is that the Congress has empowered presidents, including, it's kind of, as long as they did it broadly speaking, this kind of middle, center, left way, everybody was okay. And I think that applies to both trade and immigration. But once you step out, as Trump has, of that kind of centrist approach, there's a whole different thought process that kicks in with Congress. And so talk about legally and with regard to the courts, because that is on a very regular basis now being discussed, including a very bombastic, I don't know, Sotomayor, Justice Sotomayor, had a recent, you'll have to describe it, a letter, if you will, or a dissent in which she had a lot to say about immigration policy. So I'll let you take it because you're the lawyer.
Well, there's a lot there. Let me unpack it one piece at a time. The major immigration law we enacted was passed in the 1960s, and there were some follow-up laws passed in the 80s and the 90s. But for the most part, we've had zero immigration laws enacted in the last 2 decades. We just haven't had much. What does that mean? The immigration laws we have are in no way geared to the sorts of immigrants coming to the United States now. We have different types of asylum regimes. We have a significant population in the United States who perhaps came to the United States legally but overstayed a visa. We have people who came to the United States as children through perhaps no fault of their own. These are the so-called dreamers. We have lots of needs for immigration laws, and Congress has shown no interest in actually enacting them. We had a bill called the DREAM Act, which would have given some sort of status to the dreamers. I think this was a good bill. It came up for a vote several times and never got enough support. We had a comprehensive immigration bill, the Gang of Eight, if you remember that from some years ago, that came close to passing but couldn't get through the House because of some opposition. And I think opposition to immigration laws has become even more politicized in the last couple of years with President Trump's administration. So that means we're stuck, right? We're stuck with old laws that were passed at a very different time. And presidents of both parties have now tried to look to these old laws to take new executive actions. President Obama had 2 big deferred action policies, DACA as well as DAPA. The DAPA policy was halted, but the DACA policy still is in effect, and it's before the Supreme Court right now will decide whether the policy is legal, whether President Trump can suspend it. President Trump has also enacted some very ambitious and aggressive immigration laws. The Remain in Mexico policy, limitations in asylum, and more than I can even count at the moment. And the question always is this: do these old laws enacted decades ago give the executive broad discretion take these steps? I generally read discretion narrowly. I think if Congress wants to deal with an issue, Congress should deal with it, and it should not be up to an overweening executive to sort of look through the crevices of statutes and find new types of authority.
And that's kind of a more libertarian approach to the law in general, a skepticism of the executive, no matter which party they are of, right?
Yeah, I'm skeptical of governmental power, whoever wields it, generally. If the president has a statute that seems to clearly delegate a power, then I'm okay with the president exercising it. If the president relies on a statute that says nothing about the issue at hand, my first instinct is, did Congress address this issue? And if Congress failed to address this issue, then the president perhaps is stepping out of line.
Of course, another law that had broad discretion for the executive baked into it and just had a important decision from the Supreme Court in terms of hearing a case, and that's often the most interesting aspect of some of the Supreme Court discussions is whether you are hearing the case or not. But Obamacare, you've written a lot about it. Again, the law had broad discretion for the executive. There's a lot of different policies inherent in it, and the case deals with taxation and how that law came to be legal or not. And a funny story about Obamacare before I toss this over to you. So the morning of the original decision, when Roberts kind of saved the law through some creative interpretation, about 4 a.m, my middle child was born. And so my wife and I were all
June 20th, 2012.
Yeah, we're in the recovery room at the hospital, and I know that Obamacare is being handed down by the Supreme Court in the decision. And so, I'm exhausted. My wife is both on drugs and exhausted, and we're sitting there watching TV because this decision is coming down. And of course, that morning, all the media people are saying, Obama has been overturned by the U.S. Supreme Court. So I'm thinking, yes, healthy daughter and Obamacare overturned. And we turn off the TV. We're hanging out, just talking about other stuff. And 10, 15, 20 minutes later, I turn the TV on or pay attention back to it. And everybody's saying, Obamacare has been upheld by the Supreme Court. And I thought, I wasn't that tired. I remember this so-and-so, on TV saying that it was overturned 10 minutes ago, and now they're saying it's been upheld. What gives? Anyway, just a personal story about that particular case, and of course you've written about it. So talk about, you're writing on Obamacare, you've written a couple books. What is overall your impression of this law and its constitutionality and how the court's going to grapple with it yet again?
I have a similar story. On June 20th, 2012, the date of your child's birthday, I had a flight to London, which was scheduled in advance, and we were supposed to leave from Chicago O'Hare around 10:30 Eastern time. And usually the Supreme Court releases their opinions at 10 Eastern time. So, okay, whatever. I'll download the opinion and then read it on the plane. There was no Wi-Fi back then. I'll download the opinion, read it on the plane. So we're sitting there on the tarmac and we're boarding, and something's odd. We're in Chicago O'Hare and things moving quickly. We're on time. There's no delays. And then we start taxiing, and I realize, wait a minute, this might not work. And they decide one case, I download that opinion. They decide a second case, download that opinion. And then I'm still waiting for the decision. And then as we're taxiing, I get a message, and its alert says, the Supreme Court declared Obamacare unconstitutional. Oh my God, this is it, right? This is it. And then I still don't have the opinion because the website was flooded. We're about to take off, and I get this last-minute message from my girlfriend who wrote, Chief Justice voted to uphold the law as a tax. And then silence for 8 hours as we crossed the pond. It was cathartic. In hindsight, I'm actually grateful for that solipsism, whatever word you want to use, that sort of isolation where I had nothing. Just the entire world was beneath me. I had no idea what was going on. There was no Wi-Fi, nothing. I was like, huh. And I finally landed at Heathrow around midnight local time. It was quite late. And I stayed up all night reading the entire opinion. I was like, wow. And at the time, I basically finished my book, my first book, Unprecedented. And I had to rewrite the entire ending. Because I was like, that was not what I expected would happen. So I had to do a lot of rewrites. And the book was published later the next year. But here we are again, nearly 9. Not your kid's 9 years old now, right? Almost 9. 8 and
no,
change.
she'll be 8. Yeah, she'll be 8.
Okay,
yeah.
I can't count. So we're nearly 8 years away, and we'll get a decision when your kid's about to turn 9. Obamacare feels like the movie Groundhog Day, but instead of Bill Murray, we have John Roberts, where he just sort of keeps coming back into the exact same fold, taunting us about what's going to happen. I don't know which way the court will go here. I happen to think this case has some merit. I'm the only one. People think I'm insane, but I'm used to that sort of reaction.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. It would have been nice if he just made the principled / right decision right at the time, and we wouldn't have to deal with this. And of course, I know it's a political question more so than a legal question, but we've seen all the presidential candidates on the Democratic side not exactly jumping to the defense of Obamacare. All of them want to use Obamacare as a starting off point or go full bore, of course, like Bernie and Elizabeth Warren, towards much more aggressive Medicare for all. And it's exactly what a lot of conservative healthcare analysts and policy analysts said at the time, was that decision was just a stepping stone to nationalize healthcare. And I think that's being borne out politically, at least at this point. So,
right. I don't, I think it's very unlikely the court kills all of Obamacare. Maybe parts of it are set aside. But whether this country goes down the road further of Medicare for all, these other policies, I think it's going to be a political question. If the court does decide that all of Obamacare is unconstitutional, that will put the Republicans in a very tough position because they don't have a backup ready.
Yeah.
Right? They've had a decade and they don't have a backup ready. And the fact of the matter is people have come to rely on the ACA, and it would cause a massive disruption. So I think it's unlikely we see that sort of ruling, but I'm always wrong. I don't make predictions anymore.
Well, it's much like the immigration question we just talked about. Just because what Congress X does might be seen as unconstitutional or partially unconstitutional doesn't mean that Congress is willing or able to do something that is different to address the real concerns that people have in whatever policy area they're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's right. Most people, and I don't mean this as a slight, but most people have a difficult time separating law and policy. Most people think that anything that's good policy is legal, and anything that's bad policy is illegal. And I don't mean that to mock them. I think it's a very natural inclination. You're drawn towards what you like, and you're repelled from what you dislike. When I go about my legal analysis, I try to think not only do I like something or dislike it, but what would the law be independently? If we look through the veil of ignorance, we know nothing else. What's the right answer? And that's how I try to frame my my approach to the law. But I realize that leads me in unpopular positions very often.
Yeah. So let's, before we get started on some of the Supreme Court cases that you like or find the most compelling or interesting or influential, I got to do a little more prognostication, more politics. We'll see if Trump can win re-election. I'm assuming that Justice Ginsburg is holding out on retiring until her, I guess at this point, either Bernie or Bloomberg or one of the Democrats wins. I assume that you think that she would hang it up regardless after if Trump won election, but maybe not immediately, maybe down the road. How many?
I think they're going to have to weaken at Bernie her. I don't think she's going anywhere.
She's going to try to stick it out. So you think
she's not retiring voluntarily? I'll put it that way.
All right. Well, and any other justices up for replacement you think might be available for Trump during a next 4
unless
years?
Something happens with Justice Sotomayor or Breyer or Kagan, which I'm not expecting. I don't think any of the Democratic nominees will step down. Excuse me.
And most of their folks are a little older than the Republican side. Thomas is getting up there.
Thomas is a young man, though. Thomas and Alito are only a couple years apart. Thomas was put in the court when he was very, very young. I don't know that Thomas wants to retire. I think he's having a blast. People don't understand him. I think he's probably our most influential justice by far. And he has a network of clerks that are now becoming judges themselves. It's really a remarkable job he's done from someone who gets so much hate from every corner. And he's just such a humble, thoughtful guy. I hope he sticks around. I'll be frank. I don't think anyone Trump picks could beat Thomas. I think Thomas is better than anyone else on the short list. So
yeah, he's
to 120 should Clarence Thomas go.
Okay, so how old is Breyer?
80 something.
Okay,
79 or 80.
And Ginsburg is
85
up there as well.
or 86.
It has had a number of health issues. So, but you think they will not go quietly into that good night?
Quietly into the night. No, I don't think that's going to happen.
All right. Well, Supreme Court, I have to say, and I'm not going to go down this path with you because it's too perhaps titillating, too interesting to have two. Breyer's kind of a moderate center left, I guess. Ginsburg's definitely among the liberal vanguard. But if those two are rotated out for Trump nominees, that definitely changes the.
Republicans have a very bad history of picking Supreme Court candidates who are consistent. They're terrible. The Democrats are batting 1,000. They don't have any problem. So I think if you have 7 Republican appointed majorities, you'd have a consistent 5 for majority for the conservatives. So I think you need 7.
But Trump has done a better job than even Reagan in terms of. I think. I mean, maybe I'm. This is my layman speaking, but I think Trump has done a very good job.
Oh, he has. But look, I think there will be cases where Kavanaugh surprises you. I think there'll be cases when Gorsuch surprises you. But if you're asking to have a consistent conservative majority, I think you need 7.
Yeah. Well, Kavanaugh was
and
always.
Robert surprises as well.
And I think I almost think Kavanaugh was a strategic nomination by Trump to placate the George W. Bush wing of the Republican Party to try to at least throw the more traditional wing of the GOP a bone in terms of one of their guys being put up into that high office because he's not as Kavanaugh's not as ideologically conservative, I don't think, as Gorsuch. So anyway, all right. So let's talk Turkey. Let's talk Supreme Court cases. I know 100 cases is way too much for any podcast of this length to go into, although you're going to cover 100 of them in 60 minutes. Do you have a one or perhaps two most favorite, most compelling cases that you really think shape our lives in interesting ways, preferably a good decision, but maybe it could be a negative decision or something that you disagree with? Talk about the favorite, most interesting cases of the U.S. Supreme Court throughout its history, or in recent years it could be.
I'll pick an obscure one that most people don't know, but I think is actually correct. And I'll pick this one because most cases I think are wrong in some regards. There's almost every case in the book I can pick things off with it, but there's one that I think got it right from top to bottom. The case is called Barron v. Baltimore. It's an old case from the 1830s. You had a situation where a guy had a harbor. He had a dock in Baltimore Harbor. And the city did some construction and flooded his property. They made it unusable because there wasn't enough water. The water became too shallow. As a result, he sued the city of Baltimore for taking his property. Actually, we call it taking. The Fifth Amendment says if the government takes your property, they have to provide just compensation. Okay, good rule. But does the Fifth Amendment limit only the federal government, or does the Fifth Amendment limit only the states? The Supreme Court held correctly that the Fifth Amendment only controls the federal government. It does not control the states. As a result, the Baltimore citizen would have to take up a problem with his own government. He couldn't sue under the federal Constitution. I think the decision is correct. And in fact, we had a 14th Amendment which reversed that, which said that the Bill of Rights now does protect the states as well as the federal government. Why do I pick such a silly case? Because there's nothing to complain about. The Constitution was ratified to limit federal power. The text of the Constitution suggests it limits federal power, and there are other provisions that limit the state. So it's an oldie, but a goodie, that one that I quite like.
Okay, so you're saying, because you're talking 1835, you said. Now, because that preceded the adoption of the 14th Amendment, you would say that's correct. Okay.
And one of the reasons why I like it, it shows that if you don't like a constitutional ruling, you can amend the Constitution to change it. And that's a very good lesson. We don't need the courts to reverse themselves left and right. Let the courts make a ruling. I think it's most correct. And if we don't like it, amend the Constitution. I wish we did that more often. I think it would be a healthy exercise for our polity.
Well, I was going to ask you another takings question about the Kelo versus New London case.
Oh, that's a bad one.
I'll
talk about that if you want.
We can go back, but I want to talk about the Second Amendment then, because you're talking about amending the Constitution. Now, Rio Grande Foundation has engaged more actively on Second Amendment issues, especially with the advent of the red flag legislation here in New Mexico. Mm-hmm. But we talk about the First Amendment. The founding fathers used paper and pens and mail that took weeks on end to get their free speech out in many ways. Second Amendment, we've got the advent of nuclear missiles and very, very powerful weapons. So is that an area that you think that they could amend the Constitution to address machine guns and nuclear weapons under the Second Amendment? Or give me a process there, because we've kind of just come to this understanding in this country that, no, you can't have machine guns unless you go through a permitting process, and nobody's got their own B-52 bombers or anything that I know of. Certainly not with live nuclear weapons. So talk about that.
The Second Amendment provides a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. The Supreme Court went nearly 2 centuries without opining on the Second Amendment. Not till 2008 in D.C. v. Heller did the court actually discuss what that means. And Heller tells us the Second Amendment protects an individual right to keep and bear arms. Great. Wonderful. But what is an arm? So far, the court has said the arms are those that are in common possession by the people. What about, you mentioned machine guns or missile launchers and nuclear weapons. I don't know that the court will say you have the right to have an RPG. RBG will not give you a right to an RPG. That's for damn sure. But I think at a minimum, the court should recognize that a gun like an AR-15, which is in common use by millions of Americans, is an arm. In fact, if I were to show, James Madison an AR-15, you say, yeah, that kind of looks like a musket. I guess that's right. And there's a close analogy between the two. So I do think that the court should get around to it, but the court's not been very gung-ho on the Second Amendment. They've taken very few cases, only a handful, and they've shown no interest in reviewing state bans on various types of so-called assault weapons.
Yeah, and of course, when it comes to the courts, they've tended to allow, not just on the Second Amendment, but there's always that legislative nibbling at the edges thing that happens on any issue, whether it's the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment. I mean, they all, the legislatures and Congress tend to try to get away with things. I guess let's talk about the First Amendment then, McCain-Feingold, and then its reaction. I mean, the way George W. Bush handled McCain-Feingold was reprehensible, in my opinion, which he basically said, let them pass it and then let the courts decide. I mean, you're the president of a frickin' country. Make a decision based on the Constitution yourself, but you're the constitutional scholar. I'll let you opine and weigh in on that one. And also the case that cleared things up, or maybe not cleared things up, but resolved at least part of that situation. So.
Well, campaign finance law is one of these tricky things. If I go on your podcast and I say, I like this issue or I like that issue, there's no doubt that we're engaging in free speech. But I sit here in this beautiful studio with these microphones and these cameras and these very sophisticated equipment, and that stuff's not free, right? Someone, our good host, had to pay for this equipment, right? So in order to speak, money is involved, right? Money has to be involved somewhere when you're engaging in speech. It's impossible unless you're just standing in a park by yourself shouting into the wind. You're going to need money. And once we accept that money is an essential ingredient in speech, we realize that limiting the money in politics limits your ability to talk about politics. And the court has drawn these sort of funny lines where Congress can limit how much money you contribute to a candidate, but Congress can't limit how much you spend on issue advocacy related to an issue. I think this divide is kind of artificial, but that's the world that we live in. And these recent cases are merely asking, to what extent can Congress limit your ability to speak? Citizens United is a case that's quite hated by many segments, but what was it about? A group wanted to make a movie critical of Hillary Clinton, and they wanted to air that movie shortly before the election. In my mind, the government should not be able to punish you for making a movie. And if you want to use corporate funds for that movie, so be it. I think the decision, perhaps not correct in all its regards, but reached the right result. The government can't shut down a movie. During the arguments, the question came up, can the government censor a book? What if corporate funds used to print a book? Can that be shut down? And the court said, no, you can't stop books, you can't stop movies, and you can't stop podcasts. I think the only thing that can stop a podcast is my heart stop in a few minutes. So I think maybe we can seg there, but I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak about these cases.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I know we've just got a couple minutes to go, so I guess we will wrap up on any worst Supreme Court cases, anything that you think the court really needs to revisit?
Oh, yeah. I got, you mentioned earlier, is Kelo. Kelo v. New London is a 2005 case involving eminent domain. Eminent domain is the power of the state to take property. This case held that the state has a broad power to take property. If the state determines that they can turn your home into a profitable office park or a hotel or a 7-Eleven or a Costco, if your property can generate more tax revenue by being repurposed, your property can be taken from you and converted to that usage and transferred to a private party. This was a 5-4 decision that I think is ripe for being overruled. I don't think any state has relied on it. In fact, most states have opposed it. And I think we need to get that case off the 100 list and put into the trash bin.
All right. Well, thank you for visiting New Mexico, and thank you for listening to this week's podcast. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing to Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.